Shadows beneath the surface. The air inside the grand ballroom shimmered with excitement. Guests, dressed in their finest, chattered with enthusiasm, the clinking of crystal glasses creating a soft, harmonious backdrop. Laughter filled the space, but in one quiet corner, a young girl stood alone, her hands gripping the hem of her pale lavender dress. Her eyes, wide and bright, flicked nervously around the room, always returning to the figure of her father, a tall, imposing man who was greeting guests with exaggerated smiles. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, or so everyone kept telling her. The wedding of her mother, Lily, to her stepfather, James, had been planned for months, an event that seemed to sweep the little girl, Ava, along like a leaf in a river current. But Ava's smile, small and fragile, told another story, a secret buried so deep it was like a stone lodged in her heart. James, the man who was set to become her new father, seemed perfect to everyone else, charming, successful, generous. To Ava, however, he was the reason for the darkness in her life, the shadow that clouded every moment. As the festivities built up around her, Ava's eyes drifted toward the stage, where the microphone stood, gleaming under the soft lights. Her heart raced as a terrifying but determined thought flashed through her mind. She had to speak. She had to tell someone. Lily, the bride, was everything you'd expect on her wedding day, glowing with joy. Her eyes sparkled as she moved through the crowd, greeting relatives and friends, her delicate lace dress trailing behind her like a whisper. Lily had met James just a year ago, and to her, he was the missing piece that made their little family whole after years of struggling on her own. He was supportive, attentive, and seemed to love Ava as much as he loved her. But Lily, always busy with work and the demands of planning the perfect wedding, hadn't seen the cracks in the perfect facade that Ava noticed all too well. As the evening progressed and the time for the ceremony drew near, Ava felt her stomach twist in knots. She knew what she needed to do, but the weight of her secret felt like chains around her small frame. Her father had always been strict, demanding perfection, but ever since James had entered their lives, Ava's world had shifted from strict to suffocating. The first time he'd locked her in the basement, it was just for an hour. Ava had been playing too loudly while James was on a business call, and her punishment had come swift and silent. He'd ushered her down into the cold, musty cellar with a stern look, and she'd stayed there, crying in the dark until her mother had come home, none the wiser. Each time after that, the duration increased, 2 hours, 4 hours, always for minor mistakes. Ava had never told her mother. She didn't know why. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was confusion, but the words had never come. Tonight, though, everything felt different. The voices in the room blended into a blur as her heart thudded in her chest. She needed to speak now, before it was too late. Just as she was mustering the courage to move toward the stage, Ava's father, James, appeared at her side. He knelt down, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "You ready for the big moment, sweetheart?" His voice was smooth, dripping with the warmth that fooled everyone else. His fingers, however, tightened ever so slightly, enough to send a clear message. Ava swallowed, forcing herself to nod. Her throat felt dry as sandpaper, and her lips trembled, but she couldn't find her voice. "Good," he whispered, his smile broadening. "Now you be a good girl, and everything will go perfectly tonight. You wouldn't want to ruin your mother's special day, would you?" Ava shook her head. She knew what he meant. Any slip-up, any sign of defiance, would mean another trip to the cellar. And with all these guests around, no one would hear her if she screamed. She could already picture the heavy door closing behind her, plunging her into that suffocating darkness. With that warning hanging in the air, James stood and walked back toward Lily, his demeanor completely shifting back to the charming groom-to-be. Ava's eyes followed him, and she watched as he slipped his arm around her mother's waist, laughing and talking with a group of family members as if nothing was wrong. Ava clenched her small fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't stand by and let her mother marry him. But what could she do? Who would believe her? She was just a kid, and he was so convincing, so likable to everyone around him. Just then, Lily's best friend, Sarah, caught sight of Ava and waved her over. "Come here, sweetheart. Let me see that beautiful dress." Sarah had always been kind to her, treating her like her own daughter. Ava hesitated for a moment, but then walked over, feeling a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone might notice something was wrong. Sarah crouched down to her level, brushing a stray lock of hair from Ava's face. "You nervous?" she asked gently, her eyes warm and understanding. Ava nodded slightly, unsure how to answer. Nervous didn't even begin to cover the flood of emotions raging inside her. Sarah smiled and took both of Ava's hands in her own. "You're going to be an amazing flower girl, Ava. Your mom is so proud of you, and I'm sure James is too. You've grown up into such a brave, smart girl." Brave. That word stuck in Ava's mind, repeating over and over. What did it mean to be brave? Did it mean staying silent and enduring everything for her mother's sake? Or did it mean standing up and doing what she knew deep down was right? Her gaze drifted once more to the microphone, shimmering under the lights. The thought returned with even more force now. She had to speak. She had to tell someone. Ava started, but her voice trailed off, her fear choking her words before they could escape. "What is it, honey?" Sarah asked, her expression softening into one of concern. She leaned in closer, sensing something was amiss. "You can tell me anything, okay?" For a split second, Ava considered spilling everything. The cellar, the punishments, the terror that lived inside her every time she was near James. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw him watching her. His eyes were locked on hers, cold and mourning. The words shriveled up in her throat, and she shook her head quickly, biting her lip. "Nothing," she mumbled, looking down at the ground. Sarah gave her a curious look but didn't push further. "All right, sweetie. You just let me know if you need anything, okay?" Ava nodded, but as Sarah walked away to join the other bridesmaids, the crushing weight of what she had to do settled on her shoulders. Her heart raced faster, and she knew she couldn't stay silent much longer. Her mother was about to walk down the aisle to marry a man she didn't truly know. A man who was hiding dark secrets. A man who would continue to hurt her. And in that moment, Ava made a decision that would change everything. A whisper turns to a scream. Ava's decision hit her like a wave, rising suddenly and swallowing her fear. She couldn't let her mother marry James, not like this. The reality of what she had to do weighed heavy on her heart, but it also gave her strength she hadn't felt before. The secret she had been carrying alone now seemed too big, too suffocating, and she knew that if she didn't speak, the darkness would never leave her. The ceremony was about to begin, and the reception hall had quieted down. Guests were starting to take their seats, their voices falling into respectful murmurs. The soft music playing in the background created an atmosphere of joy and anticipation, but for Ava, it felt like a countdown to disaster. She watched as her mother disappeared into the bridal suite for one last touch-up. Lily's laughter echoed faintly as the bridesmaids swirled around her, fixing her veil, adjusting her dress. Ava stood just outside the room, her small hands clenched at her sides. She was going to have to do it soon. Her heart pounded in her chest as she made her way toward the stage, eyes flicking back to make sure James wasn't watching her. The microphone stood on a simple wooden podium at the center of the stage, waiting for the officiant to announce the start of the ceremony. Ava knew that once the vows began, it would be too late. She had to act before James saw her, before anyone stopped her. She had to protect her mother. Just as she was about to take a step toward the stage, a voice cut through her thoughts. "Ava, there you are." It was Lily's voice, sweet and soft as always. Ava spun around to see her mother approaching, radiant in her wedding gown. Her long veil trailed behind her, and her eyes sparkled with happiness that made Ava's heart ache. "You look so beautiful, sweetheart," Lily said, kneeling down in front of Ava. She adjusted a few strands of her daughter's hair that had come loose and smiled. "Are you ready to be the best flower girl ever?" Ava felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to say something, anything, but the sight of her mother, so happy, so hopeful, made the words get stuck. Lily wasn't just her mother. She was her protector, her safe place. How could Ava destroy her happiness in a single breath? How could she tell her that the man she was about to marry had been locking her in a dark, cold cellar whenever he was angry? Her mind raced, her thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. But before she could say anything, the wedding coordinator entered the room, clapping her hands with authority. "It's time, everyone. The ceremony is starting in just a few minutes." Ava's heart sank as her mother stood up, giving her one last smile before walking toward the doors that led to the aisle. Ava could hear the rustling of dresses, the soft footsteps of the bridesmaids lining up, the final checks being made for what should have been a perfect day. Ava stood frozen. Time was slipping away, and she was running out of options. The guests rose from their seats as the music swelled, filling the grand hall with a symphony of elegance. Lily, glowing in her white gown, stepped onto the aisle, her arm linked with her father's. She was the picture of a perfect bride, her smile wide, her eyes brimming with emotion. The crowd watched with admiration, cameras flashing to capture each precious moment. Ava's hands trembled as she clutched her small basket of flower petals. She walked ahead of the bride, her steps slow and measured, but her mind was in turmoil. Each step felt heavier than the last, and her vision blurred as her anxiety built. James stood at the end of the aisle, looking impeccable in his suit, his smile wide, as he watched Lily approach. But to Ava, his smile was a mask, one that hid the cruel man underneath. With each step, Ava's resolve grew stronger. The weight of her secret pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She knew what she had to do. As she reached the front of the aisle, Ava hesitated. She glanced around, hoping someone, anyone, would see the fear in her eyes. But no one did. Everyone was focused on the bride, on the beauty of the moment. Lily joined James at the altar, and the officiant began to speak, his voice smooth and practiced. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Lily and James." Ava's stomach twisted as the words washed over her. She felt the familiar sensation of panic clawing at her insides, threatening to consume her. She glanced up at James, and for a brief moment, his eyes met hers. The look he gave her was sharp, a silent warning to keep quiet, to play along. Her heart raced as she realized she had no more time to wait. Her hands tightened around the handle of her flower basket, and with a deep breath, she stepped forward. I have something to say." Ava's voice trembled as she spoke, her small frame shaking with the effort. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. Every eye in the room turned to her. The officiant stopped mid-sentence, looking down at her in confusion. James's smile faltered, and he took a step forward. "Ava, sweetie, now's not the time." "No." Ava's voice rose, surprising even herself. Her face flushed with fear, but she pushed forward. "I need to say something. Please, everyone needs to know." Lily's brow furrowed in confusion as she looked down at her daughter, her eyes searching Ava's face for answers. "Ava, what's going on? What are you talking about?" Tears welled up in Ava's eyes as she struggled to find the right words. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to keep going. "James, he locks me in the cellar. He makes me stay there when I do something wrong. It's dark and cold, and I'm so scared." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Lily's face paled, her mouth falling open in shock. She took a step back, her eyes darting between Ava and James, who now stood frozen, his face drained of color. For a moment, no one moved. The room was silent, the weight of Ava's revelation hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Then, as if a dam had broken, the whispers began, spreading quickly through the crowd. Lily stumbled forward, her hand covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Ava, what are you saying? That can't be true. James would never. But Ava shook her head violently, her small voice filled with desperation. It's true, Mom. He locks me in the dark, and I'm so scared. Please believe me. James stepped forward, his expression hardening. This is ridiculous. She's just a child. She's confused. No. Ava cried out, her voice trembling but strong. I'm not lying. You make me stay there for hours. You hurt me. The room erupted into chaos. Guests stood, murmuring in shock, their eyes locked on James and Lily. Lily, tears streaming down her face, turned to James, her voice breaking. Is this true? Tell me she's lying, James. Please, tell me she's lying. James's face twisted into something unrecognizable, an expression Ava had seen before, but never in front of anyone else. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Sarah, Lily's best friend, rushed forward. Ava, sweetie, come here, Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with concern. She knelt down and pulled Ava into her arms, shielding her from the growing tension in the room. At that moment, Lily's world seemed to fall apart. Her eyes flicked back to James, whose face had gone dark with anger. His once charming smile was gone, replaced with a cold, hard expression. What is she talking about, James? Lily's voice trembled as she demanded answers. Tell me the truth. James stood there, his face hard as stone. He opened his mouth to speak, but before any more lies could escape, the door at the back of the room flew open. 2 police officers stepped inside, their expressions grim as they scanned the room. Someone had called the authorities. The shattering of illusions. The room fell into a stunned silence as the 2 police officers stepped inside, their presence an undeniable signal that the wedding had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. The once celebratory atmosphere, filled with laughter and joy, now crackled with tension. Guests shifted in their seats, whispering to one another, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding before them. Ava, still wrapped in Sarah's protective embrace, could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The fear she had been holding onto for so long was now out in the open, and though it terrified her, there was a sense of relief too. She had spoken the truth, finally. She had broken free of the silence that had held her captive for what felt like forever. But now, as she watched the officers approach, the reality of what was about to happen settled heavily on her small shoulders. Lily, her face ashen, stood frozen in place. Her gaze shifted between James and Ava, disbelief and confusion clouding her features. This was the man she had planned to spend the rest of her life with, the man who had promised her a future of happiness and security. But now, as the weight of Ava's words sank in, that vision of their perfect life was crumbling before her eyes. James, on the other hand, had gone rigid. His eyes darkened, and his jaw tightened as he watched the officers approach. The mask he had worn so convincingly for so long began to crack. He was a man used to control over his life, his image, and most of all, over Ava. But now, that control was slipping away, and his expression betrayed the fury simmering just beneath the surface. One of the officers, a tall woman with short-cropped hair and a calm, steady demeanor, stepped forward and addressed the room. We received a call regarding an incident involving a minor. We need to speak with Ava Thompson and her guardians. Sarah instinctively tightened her grip on Ava, but she met the officer's gaze and nodded. I'm here with her. This is Ava, she said softly, her voice filled with protectiveness. Lily blinked, the reality of the situation still not fully registering. Wait, what's happening? She asked, her voice trembling. Who called the police? This is a mistake. This can't be real. She turned toward James, her voice growing more desperate. James, please, tell me this isn't true. James's expression hardened even further, his eyes narrowing at Ava. She's making it up, he spat, his voice low and cold. She's a child, Lily. Children exaggerate. You know how she's been lately, ever since the wedding planning started. It's stressful for kids too. But even as the words left his mouth, there was something in his tone, something off, something hollow, that made Lily hesitate. She had trusted him completely, but now doubt was creeping into the cracks of her once solid belief in him. The second officer, a shorter man with kind eyes, stepped forward to address Ava directly. He knelt down to her level, his voice soft and calm. Ava, can you tell us what happened? It's important that we understand the situation. Ava glanced at him, her small frame trembling. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, watching, waiting. She knew that her next words would change everything forever. Her mother, her friends, the guests, all of them would know the truth. But Ava was ready. She had already taken the hardest step by speaking up. Now she had to finish what she'd started. Swallowing her fear, Ava nodded slowly and began to speak, her voice quiet but steady. He locks me in the cellar, she said, her words carrying the weight of months of terror. When I do something wrong, or if I'm too loud, he takes me downstairs and locks the door. It's dark, and I'm scared. Sometimes, I'm there for hours. Lily's hand flew to her mouth as a sob escaped her. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at her daughter, her heart breaking. Ava, why didn't you tell me? She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ava looked up at her mother, her own eyes brimming with tears. I was scared, she admitted. I didn't want to ruin everything. I didn't think you'd believe me. I thought, maybe I was just being bad. The pain in Lily's eyes was unbearable. She stepped forward, reaching for her daughter, but the officers gently held her back for the moment. We need to speak to Ava alone, the female officer said, her tone firm but compassionate. It's important we get a clear picture of what's been happening. No, Lily protested weakly, her hands shaking. Please, I need to be with her. I didn't know. I didn't see. Her voice broke, and she turned to Sarah, who had tears in her eyes as well. How did I not see it? How could I not know this was happening to my own child? James's face twisted in fury. This is ridiculous, he snapped, his voice rising. She's confused. She's a little girl. This is all just a big misunderstanding. You can't just believe everything a child says. The male officer stood up, his gaze locking on James with calm authority. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation. For now, we need to ensure the safety of the child. As the officers began to move toward James, his composure finally broke. He stepped back, his face red with anger. You're not taking me anywhere, he shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. This is my wedding day, and you're not ruining it with these lies. But before he could take another step, the officers were already moving to restrain him. The guests gasped as James struggled against them, his once perfect image shattering in front of everyone's eyes. You're ruining everything, he yelled, his voice filled with desperation. Lily stood in shock, unable to process the scene unfolding before her. The man she had trusted, the man she was about to marry, was being handcuffed in front of her eyes, all because of the lies he had spun for months, maybe longer. Her heart felt like it had been torn from her chest, leaving her hollow and numb. As the officers led James away, still protesting, Lily turned toward Ava, tears streaming down her face. She knelt down, pulling her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly. I'm so sorry, Ava, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know. I should have known. I should have protected you. Ava clung to her mother, tears spilling from her eyes as well. I was scared, Mom. I didn't know what to do. I thought you'd be mad. Lily shook her head, her hands trembling as she stroked Ava's hair. Never, Ava. I would never be mad at you for telling the truth. I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I'm so sorry. The guests around them were silent, watching the heartbreaking scene with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. Sarah stood close by, her own eyes filled with tears, but also with a fierce protectiveness for both Lily and Ava. She had always known there was something off about James, but she had never imagined it was this. The ceremony was over. There would be no wedding today. In the hours that followed, the police questioned Ava further, carefully gathering every detail. Lily sat with her, never leaving her side, her face etched with sorrow and guilt. How had she missed the signs? How had she been so blind to the suffering of her own daughter? Sarah remained nearby, a comforting presence, though her heart ached for her friend. As the sun set outside the grand reception hall, the echoes of what could have been still lingered in the air. The guests had long since left, their murmurs of shock and sympathy fading into the background. What had once been a day filled with hope and joy was now tainted with heartbreak. Lily sat quietly, her fingers tracing the lace of her wedding dress absent-mindedly. She had dreamed of this day for so long, but now the dress felt like a cage, a reminder of the life she had almost walked into with a man she barely knew. She looked over at Ava, who was sitting quietly, her eyes red from crying, but her spirit visibly lighter. "Ava," Lily whispered, reaching for her daughter's hand. "I promise you, from now on, I'll never let anything like this happen again. I will protect you. Always." Ava looked up at her mother, her expression softening. "I know, Mom," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I know." As the night deepened and the officers prepared to leave, Lily realized that the road ahead would be long and painful, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had lost something today, but she had gained something far more important, a renewed bond with her daughter, built on trust, truth, and love. Healing wounds, building trust. The next morning dawned quietly. Sunlight streamed through the windows of their small house, casting soft golden rays across the living room. It should have been a day filled with wedding gifts and laughter, with photos being shared and stories of love being told. Instead, the aftermath of the previous day's revelations hung over the house like a heavy fog, stifling any sense of normalcy. Healing wounds, building trust. The next morning dawned quietly. Sunlight streamed through the windows of their small house, casting soft golden rays across the living room. It should have been a day filled with wedding gifts and laughter, with photos being shared and stories of love being told. Instead, the aftermath of the previous day's revelations hung over the house like a heavy fog, stifling any sense of normalcy. Lily sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea that had long since grown cold. She hadn't slept. Her mind had raced all night, replaying every moment from the ceremony. The shock in Ava's voice, the terror in her eyes, the cold, twisted expression on James's face as he was led away in handcuffs. It all felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. But the truth was clear. She had failed her daughter in a way she could never have imagined. How could she not have seen the signs? Ava sat across from her, silently poking at her breakfast, pushing scrambled eggs around the plate without eating a bite. She hadn't said much since the police had left the night before. The weight of what she'd revealed, and the storm it had caused, still lingered in her small frame. Her eyes, red from crying, flicked up to meet her mother's gaze now and then, searching for reassurance, for some sign that everything would be okay. But Lily didn't know how to give that to her, not yet. The quiet between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity, neither knowing what to say. Ava had lived with her secret for so long, and now that it was out, they both seemed unsure of what to do next. The house felt different, hollow, as if James's presence had left a void that couldn't easily be filled. Finally, Lily broke the silence. "Ava, honey." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the guilt gnawing at her insides. "I'm so sorry." She paused, her hand shaking slightly as she set down her mug. "I don't know how I didn't see what was happening. I should have protected you." Ava's eyes flicked up from her plate, her small face filled with a mix of confusion and sadness. "I didn't want to make you sad," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you'd be mad at me if I told." Lily's heart clenched at the words. The idea that her daughter had been suffering in silence, afraid that she would somehow be to blame for the abuse, shattered her. She reached across the table and gently took Ava's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Oh, Ava, you could never make me mad by telling me the truth. I'm so sorry I didn't notice. I should have known something was wrong. But Her voice broke again, and tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't, and for that, I'm so sorry." Ava looked down at their joined hands, her small fingers curling around her mother's. For a long moment, she was silent. Then she spoke in a soft, tremulous voice. "I didn't think anyone would believe me. James always said, he always told me that no one would believe me, that it was my fault." Lily's breath hitched at the mention of James's name. The man she had loved, trusted, and nearly married had twisted their lives into something unrecognizable. She had let him into their home, believing he was the answer to their prayers, never realizing that behind his charming smile was a man capable of such cruelty. "I believe you," Lily said firmly, her voice filled with conviction despite the tears streaming down her face. "I believe every word you said, Ava, and I'm going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. You don't have to be scared anymore. I'm here, and I'll never let anyone hurt you again." Ava's lip quivered, and she blinked back the tears that had been threatening to fall. Slowly, she stood up from her chair and walked around the table. Lily opened her arms, and Ava fell into them, hugging her mother tightly, the weight of her emotions spilling out all at once. The little girl cried, not just for the fear and pain she had endured, but for the release of a secret she had held on to for too long. Lily held her daughter close, rocking her gently, her own tears falling freely. In that moment, everything else, the shame, the guilt, the questions, fell away. All that mattered was Ava. She was safe now, and that was all Lily could focus on. As the days passed, the house slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy, though it was a new normal, one filled with the delicate work of healing. The investigation into James's actions had begun in earnest, and Lily found herself speaking with police officers and child protective services more often than she could have imagined. Every conversation brought a fresh wave of grief and guilt, but she faced it head-on for Ava's sake. She had failed to protect her once. She wouldn't fail her again. Sarah, true to her nature, had been a constant presence, supporting them both through the difficult days that followed. She visited daily, bringing food, lending a listening ear, and helping Lily navigate the legal complexities of the situation. She also kept the outside world at bay, managing the inevitable questions from family and friends about why the wedding had been called off so abruptly. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and phone calls with lawyers and investigators, Lily sat with Sarah on the porch. The sky had turned a dusky pink, and the cool breeze offered some relief from the heaviness that had been hanging over them for days. "I just keep thinking," Lily said quietly, her voice breaking the stillness of the evening. "How could I have missed it? How could I have let this happen under my own roof? Ava was suffering, and I was so wrapped up in planning a wedding, in being happy, that I didn't even see it." Sarah turned to her, her expression soft but firm. "Lily, you can't blame yourself for everything. You were trying to build a life for you and Ava, a good life. And James, he was good at hiding who he really was. You're not the first person to be deceived by someone like that." Lily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know, but still, she's my daughter. I should have known something was wrong. I should have been paying more attention." "You're paying attention now," Sarah said gently, placing a hand on Lily's arm. "And that's what matters. You're here for her, and you're doing everything you can to protect her now. That's all anyone can ask of you." Lily nodded, but the guilt still lingered. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, for either of them. Ava was still a child, and the trauma she had endured would take time to heal. But for the first time in what felt like ages, Lily felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived the storm, And now, they could begin to rebuild. A week after the wedding that never was, Lily sat down with Ava in the living room, their usual spot for evening talks. The police investigation was ongoing, and they had been advised that it could take some time for all the details to be sorted out. James was facing charges of child endangerment and abuse, and the legal system was moving slowly but surely toward justice. Ava had been quiet in the days following her revelation, but she had started to open up more, bit by bit. She had started drawing again, something she hadn't done in months, and her drawings, while still dark at times, seemed to reflect the slow return of her confidence. As they sat together on the couch, Ava fiddled with a sketchpad in her lap, her pencil moving quietly across the page. Lily watched her for a moment, her heart swelling with love for her brave little girl. "Ava," Lily said softly, "I know things have been hard lately, but I want you to know we're going to be okay. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you feel safe again." Ava looked up from her drawing, her big eyes filled with the wisdom of a child who had seen more than she should have. "I know, Mom," she said quietly, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I feel better now that it's all out. It's not a secret anymore." Lily smiled, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "No more secrets. Okay. You can always tell me anything. I'm here for you, no matter what." Ava nodded, her smile growing a little wider. "I promise. No more secrets." The two sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past weeks slowly lifting. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they were together, and they were moving forward. In that moment, Lily realized that while their journey toward healing would be long, they were taking the first steps. And that was enough. The path to recovery. The days after Ava's brave confession stretched into weeks, and soon the autumn leaves began to fall outside their house. The quiet rustle of wind through the trees seemed to mirror the quietness within the walls of Lily and Ava's home. The world had not stopped, but for them, everything had changed. Lily was adjusting to her new reality, one where James was no longer part of their lives, but his absence brought its own kind of pain. Not because she missed him. No, she had come to terms with the fact that the man she thought she loved never truly existed, but because every day she saw the remnants of his cruelty in her daughter's eyes. Ava was slowly recovering, but the shadows of fear still lingered in her, like bruises that hadn't quite faded. Lily had done her best to maintain a routine for Ava, trying to bring back a sense of normalcy into their lives. The mornings started with breakfast, followed by schoolwork, then art sessions where Ava would draw quietly while Lily handled phone calls and paperwork for the investigation. They had enrolled Ava in therapy, a recommendation from the child services representative who had been assigned to their case. The first few sessions had been difficult. Ava didn't want to talk to the therapist at first, and Lily had been nervous about the idea of letting a stranger into their private pain. But the therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Harper, had a calm and gentle way about her that eventually put Ava at ease. Slowly, the walls Ava had built around herself began to crack, and she started to speak more openly about her experiences. One afternoon after Ava's therapy session, Dr. Harper asked Lily to stay behind for a moment. Ava had already run off to the small play area in the waiting room, her fingers tracing the edge of a coloring book absent-mindedly. "How is she really doing?" Lily asked, her voice barely hiding the desperation she felt. "Is she going to be okay? I mean, really okay?" Dr. Harper smiled kindly, but there was a seriousness in her eyes. "Ava's making progress," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "But it's going to take time. What she went through was traumatic, and while she's young and resilient, healing doesn't happen overnight." Lily nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle on her. She had known from the beginning that recovery would be a long process, but hearing it from a professional somehow made it more real. "What can I do to help her?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. "I don't want to mess this up." "You're already doing so much," Dr. Harper reassured her. "You're providing a safe and loving environment. And that's the most important thing. Just continue to be patient with her, listen when she's ready to talk, and most of all, keep reminding her that she's not alone in this. You're both going through a healing process, and it's okay for it to be messy. Lily swallowed hard, nodding. And what about me? She asked softly. I feel like I've failed her. I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. Dr. Harper's expression softened. Lily, blaming yourself won't help Ava or you. Abusers are manipulative, and James created an environment where it was hard for you to see the truth. You weren't the one who hurt Ava, he was. What matters now is that you're taking action. You're protecting her, and you're doing everything you can to help her heal. Lily wiped at her eyes, nodding again. I just don't know how to forgive myself, she whispered. That will come with time too, Dr. Harper said gently. But you're on the right path. Later that evening, as the sun set outside their home, Lily sat on the couch, watching Ava play with her dolls. It was a simple scene, one that had played out countless times before in their lives. But now it felt different. There was a fragile peace that had settled over their home, and Lily was determined to protect it. Ava's therapy sessions had started to unlock pieces of her personality that Lily feared had been lost. The quiet, withdrawn girl who had been carrying the burden of her secret was slowly giving way to the bright, creative child she had always been. Ava's drawings, once dark and filled with shadowy figures, had begun to shift too. She was drawing flowers again, scenes of bright fields and happy animals. It was a small change, but it felt like a victory. Mom, Ava said suddenly, looking up from her dolls, do you think I'll ever stop being scared? The question caught Lily off guard. She looked at her daughter, her heart breaking at the thought of how much fear Ava had carried inside her. She thought carefully before responding. I think being scared is normal after what happened, Lily said gently. But I also think that over time, the fear will get smaller. And I'll be here with you, every step of the way, to make sure you feel safe. Ava seemed to think about this for a moment, her small face serious. Okay, she said softly, as if the simple reassurance was enough for now. But can we always keep the lights on in the hallway at night? Lily smiled, nodding. Of course. Anything that helps you feel safe. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation into James's actions progressed. Lily had been called to testify during the preliminary hearings, an experience that had left her shaken but resolute. She had recounted, in detail, everything she had learned from Ava, and while reliving those moments had been painful, it was also cathartic. She had finally confronted the full extent of the darkness that James had brought into their lives. One evening, after another long day of meetings with lawyers and social workers, Lily received a phone call from the detective in charge of their case. She braced herself for more bad news, but this time, the news was different. We've gathered enough evidence, the detective said, his voice steady. James has agreed to a plea deal. He'll be facing several years in prison, and there will be strict restrictions in place if he ever gets out. You and Ava will be protected. Lily let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was over. The legal battles, the endless questions, the uncertainty. Finally, they could begin to move on. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with relief. After she hung up the phone, she sat there for a long moment, letting the news sink in. The man who had hurt her daughter was gone. He wouldn't be able to hurt them anymore. The weight that had been pressing down on her chest for so long began to lift, little by little. That night, as Lily tucked Ava into bed, she sat on the edge of her daughter's bed and gently smoothed the blankets around her. Ava's eyes were heavy with sleep, but she looked up at her mother with a soft smile. Mom, she murmured, do you think everything will be better now? Lily's heart swelled with love for her daughter, and she leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. I think we're going to be okay, she whispered. It's going to take time, but we're going to be okay. Ava snuggled deeper into her blankets, her eyes closing as sleep began to claim her. I love you, "Mom," she whispered. "I love you too, Ava," Lily replied, her voice thick with emotion. She sat there for a long while, watching her daughter sleep, the soft rise and fall of her chest, a reminder of how far they had come. In the months that followed, life slowly began to return to something resembling normal. Ava's therapy continued, and she grew more confident each day. Her laughter, once rare, now filled their home again. She started making new friends at school, and while there were still moments when fear crept back in, especially at night, when the house was dark and quiet, those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. For Lily, the process of forgiving herself was ongoing. She knew that healing wasn't a straight line, and there were days when the guilt and sadness would wash over her like a tidal wave. But each day, she reminded herself of the progress they had made, of how far they had come. She had learned to lean on the support of Sarah and Ava's therapist and the small circle of friends who had stood by them through everything. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Ava turned to her mother with a thoughtful expression. "Mom," she said, "I think I want to talk about James with Dr. Harper next time. Like, really talk about it. Not just the bad stuff, but how I feel now that he's gone." Lily smiled, her heart swelling with pride at her daughter's bravery. "I think that's a great idea, Ava. I'm proud of you." Ava smiled back, her eyes bright with determination. "I just want to feel better, you know. I don't want to be scared anymore." Lily nodded, pulling her daughter close. "And you will, sweetheart. You're already so strong. We're going to get through this together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft golden light, Lily felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, like a new bloom just beginning to open, but it was there, and it was growing. The road to recovery might be long, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they were walking it together. A new beginning. Spring had arrived. The world outside Lily and Ava's home was awakening, as if the earth itself was shaking off the weight of winter, much like the heaviness that had been slowly lifting from their lives. The days were longer, the air smelled of fresh blooms, and sunlight streamed through the windows in golden rays that filled their home with warmth. It was a stark contrast to the dark days of the past months. And just as nature seemed to be finding its way back to life, so too were Lily and Ava. The house, which had once felt so suffocating and filled with shadows, now felt lighter, more alive. Ava's laughter echoed through the hallways again, her drawings filled with bright colors and joyful scenes, fields of flowers, smiling animals, rainbows arching across clear skies. The heavy, dark drawings that once reflected her inner world were now safely tucked away, relics of a past she was learning to let go of. But it wasn't just Ava who was healing. Lily, too, had found a new sense of peace. She had spent months working through her own guilt, her own sorrow. It hadn't been easy. There were still moments where she woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding with the sudden terror of what could have been. But those moments were becoming less frequent. The nightmares, the guilt, the relentless questioning of how she could have missed what had been happening right under her nose, they were no longer constant companions. One sunny Saturday morning, Lily stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, while Ava sat at the table, sketching quietly. The smell of fresh syrup and butter filled the air, and the atmosphere was calm and comforting, a far cry from the tension that had once gripped their lives. Sarah had promised to come over later that day, and they had planned a picnic in the park to celebrate the coming of spring. For the first time in a long time, Lily felt excited about the future. "Mom," Ava said suddenly, breaking the quiet as she set her pencil down. "Can I ask you something?" Lily turned from the stove, a soft smile on her face. "Of course, sweetie. You can ask me anything." Ava hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking down to her sketchbook. She was quiet for a few seconds, gathering her thoughts, before she spoke again. "Do you think I'll ever really forget what happened with James? Like, will it always be there?" Lily's heart ached at the question, But she had promised herself long ago that she would always be honest with her daughter. No more secrets, no more half-truths. She walked over to the table and sat down across from Ava, meeting her daughter's gaze with steady eyes. "I don't think we ever really forget things like that," Lily said gently, reaching across the table to take Ava's hand. "But I do think that, over time, it gets easier. The memories don't go away, but they stop hurting so much. And with every day that passes, you get stronger and braver. You'll learn how to live with those memories without letting them control you." Ava nodded thoughtfully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Dr. Harper said something like that, too," she said quietly. "She said that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about learning how to move forward. I think I'm starting to understand what she means." Lily's smile widened, pride swelling in her chest. "That's exactly right. You've been through something really hard, Ava, but you're not defined by it. You're so much more than what happened. And I'm so proud of you for how far you've come." Ava smiled, her eyes shining with the warmth of her mother's words. "I feel better now," she said after a moment. "Like, lighter. It's not so scary anymore. Sometimes I still get scared, especially when it's dark or when I hear a loud noise, but I'm not scared all the time like I used to be." Lily squeezed her daughter's hand. "That's because you're healing, sweetheart. It's a process, and you're doing such a great job. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. I'm always here, and so is Dr. Harper." Ava nodded, her smile growing a little wider. "I'm glad we told the truth, Mom. I'm glad we didn't keep the secret anymore." "So am I," Lily said softly. "It was brave of you to speak up, and it changed everything for the better." Later that afternoon, Sarah arrived, as she had so many times before, her arms laden with picnic baskets and blankets. They set off for the park, the three of them, walking under the bright blue sky as the warm breeze carried the scent of freshly bloomed flowers. The park was alive with the sounds of children laughing, dogs barking, and families picnicking. It felt like a perfect day, a world away from the darkness they had left behind. As they spread out the blanket under a large oak tree, Ava ran off toward the playground, her laughter trailing behind her as she joined a group of kids on the swings. Lily watched her go, her heart swelling with love. Seeing Ava so carefree and happy filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "She looks like she's doing so much better," Sarah said, sitting down beside Lily and handing her a sandwich. "I can't believe how far she's come." "She really has," Lily agreed, her eyes never leaving Ava. "She's been so strong, Sarah, stronger than I ever imagined she could be. And I think she's starting to trust herself again." "And you?" Sarah asked gently. "How are you doing, really?" Lily hesitated for a moment, considering the question. "I'm doing better too," she said after a moment. "It's been hard, harder than I expected. But I'm learning to forgive myself, little by little. There are still days when the guilt creeps back in, but I'm not letting it control me anymore." Sarah smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "I'm so proud of you, Lily. You've been through so much, but you've come out the other side stronger, and Ava's lucky to have you as her mom." Lily smiled, feeling the deep sense of gratitude for her friend's unwavering support. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. "You've been there for us every step of the way." "That's what friends are for," Sarah replied with a grin, giving Lily's arm a playful squeeze. "We're in this together, always." As the afternoon wore on, they watched as Ava played, running back and forth between the swings and the slides, her face flushed with happiness. Every so often, she would glance back at her mother, flashing a bright smile before diving back into the fun with her new friends. It was a sight that filled Lily with hope, a reminder that, despite everything, life went on, and there was so much joy still waiting for them. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Ava came running back to the blanket, breathless and beaming. "Mom, can we stay just a little longer? I made a new friend. Ova asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Lily laughed softly, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's face. Of course we can, sweetie. Take your time. Ava grinned and darted back toward the playground, her laughter filling the air. Lily watched her go, her heart swelling with pride and love. In that moment, she realized something important, something that had taken months of struggle and heartache to learn. They were going to be okay. The months that followed were filled with small victories. Ava continued to thrive in her therapy sessions, opening up more and more each week. The nightmares that had once plagued her began to fade, and her anxiety, while still present, became something she could manage with the tools she was learning. Her relationship with Lily deepened, built now on a foundation of trust, openness, and love. Lily, too, found herself healing in ways she hadn't anticipated. The weight of her guilt began to lift as she came to terms with the fact that she hadn't failed Ava. She had done the best she could with the knowledge she had. And now, with the truth out in the open, they were both free to move forward. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Ava's head resting on Lily's lap as they watched a movie, Ava looked up at her mother with a thoughtful expression. "Mom," she said softly, "I don't think I'm scared anymore. Not like I used to be." Lily smiled, her heart swelling with love. "That's because you're brave, Ava. You've faced your fears, and you've come out stronger." Ava smiled up at her, her eyes bright with the confidence that had once been buried under layers of fear. "Yeah," she said softly, "I think I am brave." Lily bent down and kissed her daughter's forehead, her heart filled with gratitude for the journey they had been on together. It hadn't been easy, but they had made it through the darkness, and now they were standing in the light. As the credits rolled on the screen and the house fell quiet, Lily whispered softly into the silence, her voice filled with love and hope. "We're going to be just fine, Ava, just fine." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lily truly believed it.